adaptations, and festival making served as agents of canon formation. The term I evoke to describe the changing policies of cultural production is most familiar in the West vis-à-vis Gorbachev's political reforms of the 1980s. But Perestroika, a nuanced term meaning restructuring, reorientation or reformation, was also pertinent to cultural policies in the 1930s. Richard Taruskin, for instance, has used the term to describe both the shifting aesthetic of Shostakovich's music and after his public lambasting in 1936, and the general restructuring of the institutions and infrastructure that mediated cultural life. Pauline Fairclough, too, has argued that there was a perestroika in Soviet symphonism in the mid-1930s, as composers sought to redirect the practices of symphonic writing to conform to the edicts of socialist realism. There was also a seismic shift in attitudes towards opera. In the 1920s, opera had been widely dismissed as an elitist form that was antithetical to the socialist aims of populist appeal. But from the 1930s, a Soviet opera project emerged to co-opt opera for its propagandistic potential, and operas began to serve the myth-making of Soviet identity. I will argue that, concomitant to the opera project amongst Russian composers that has already been explained by Marina Frolova-Walker, there was a transnational Soviet opera project that also began in the 1930s. Unlike the former project presided over by Russian composers, which never succeeded in producing a canon of Soviet operas, the transnational opera project, owing to a very different ideological and critical climate, successfully constructed a canon of operas still performed today. The success of this project owed much to the fact that these operas had a broader resonance with the ambitions of Soviet ideology. The project engendered an attempt to enact Soviet nationalities policy in the cultural sphere, constructing art that conformed to Stalin's aphorism that art should be, quote, national in form, socialist in content, end quote. The theory that socialism could be the means by which a collective Soviet identity could be forged across the disparate national identities of the Soviet Union, and the Stalinist qualifier that rescued the phenomenon of the nation-state from classical Marxist critique. Operas from the ethnic minorities began to enter the Russian repertoire in the early 1930s. For example, in a prominent 1934 Soviet opera competition, Alexander Spendyayan's Armenian opera Almast, whilst failing to win, made enough of an impression to reach Western reports of the competition, as reviewed in the New York Times. Further incentive to produce ethnic operas was also established by the construction of opera houses throughout the republics in the 1930s. But the most effective vehicle for ethnic opera came in 1936, with the establishment of the Decadas of National Art. These 10-day festivals, presided over by the newly established Committee on Arts Affairs, obtained enormous investment and boasted high propaganda value. Reports of the festivals were splashed across the front pages of Pravda and Izvestia, and detailed commentary also appeared in Moscow's art and literary journals. Each festival included a delegation of hundreds, sometimes thousands of artists and musicians. The visitors would showcase the best examples of their culture, but the most high-profile contributions were the national operas performed at the Bolshoi Theatre. A number of features point to the high cultural and political significance of the Decadas. The operas attracted attention from the Politburo itself. Stalin attended most of them, usually accompanied by high-ranking officials. Each festival ended with a grand reception in the Kremlin, at which the most illustrious of the participants, high-ranking politicians, and important figures in the art world would gather. At one such reception, at the close of the Tajik Decada in 1941, Stalin delivered a speech spelling out the affirmative action post-imperial empire that the Soviet Union was now supposed to embody, of which the Decadas were the principal physical expression. He said, "We are enjoying with you today the fruits of the friendship of the peoples. We old Bolsheviks remember how we used to call the Tsarist Russia the prison house of the people. Now we have the Soviet Union with its open cornfields, of which workers are free and equal. Such are the results of the friendship of the people's policy. The old ideology is dead. It has no future. It is anathema to the new ideology, the ideology of the friendship of the peoples, which holds that all people are equal." End quote. And this is a picture of the final concert on the Tajik Decada, which shows sort of how much the cult of personality was already taking hold. We have a Stalin figure in the background, and they're singing the Piesna o Staline, the song about Stalin. Within the discourse, the Decades were construed not only as an expression of transnational kinship, but also as a manifestation of the improving quality of life following the first 5-year plan. This was given public expression through the celebration discourse which came to the fore in the late 1930s. The linkage made between celebration and the Soviet Union's improving economic and cultural status may be seen from the 1938 official history of the Communist Party, a sanctioned document of study for millions of Soviet citizens. In this book, the festivals were discussed under the subsection Growth in the Welfare of the Workers, amidst an analysis of the economic improvements in the 1930s. It stated, quote, "There has been unprecedented growth in the art of the peoples of the USSR. Ukrainian, Georgian, Uzbek and Azeri national decades in Moscow have shown the increasing cultural profile of the peoples of the USSR, national in form, socialist in content." Expressions of cultural growth, then, were couched as a proxy of social improvement. The need for expressions of high culture from the republics to feed this public narrative meant that ethnic opera received far greater ideological and financial support than operas by Russian composers. In light of such discourse, the Decades provided a forum for new operas to be presented with minimum political scrutiny. Whilst new operas were hindered by a stuffy bureaucratic machine that fostered a climate of constant criticism and self-criticism, the ideological protectionism afforded to opera from the republics meant that composers representing the republics could do little wrong. As I shall discuss in the following section, the strong position afforded to national opera allowed these works to flourish in a variety of other cultural contexts. Moving on to film opera. In 1922, Lenin remarked to Anatoly Lunacharsky that for its propaganda value, cinema was the most important of the arts. Lunacharsky, who oversaw Soviet culture and the arts from his position as Commissar for Enlightenment in the 1920s, had been a lonely voice championing opera as a wholesome form of mass entertainment at a time when mainstream discourse accused the genre of elitism. Whilst film adaptations of operas were relatively prolific in the West, even in the silent era, it was not until the advent of sound and the increased ideological sanctioning of opera in the 1930s that Soviet filmmakers began seriously discussing the possibilities of bringing opera to the screen. And debate ranged from the ideological to the pragmatic. Lev Kulakovsky, for instance, considered the prospect of a film opera, Kino opera, a natural evolution of the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk. Emphasizing Wagner's revolutionary qualities, Kulakovsky couched the all-encompassing film opera in dialectical Marxist-Hegelian terms. Following Wagner's synthesized conception of the arts, Kulakovsky considered the film opera to signify a telos of cultural historical progress, characteristic of the final stages of capitalism. Another article, published in Искусство кино, Cinematography, proposed a sketch for a film adaptation of Ivan Vizhinsky's opera The Quiet Dawn, including a series of possible problems in translating opera to screen. The Quiet Dawn had been publicly hailed by Stalin as the socialist realism par excellence, opera par excellence, at the same time as Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth was mauled by the press. One of the authors of the article in Искусство кино, Mikhail Shapiro, would go on to direct a prominent film adaptation of the revised version of Lady Macbeth in 1967, retitled Katerina Izmailova, and with substantial input from Shostakovich himself. Shapiro and Yegorov's article was more interested in the technical practicalities of film opera rather than ideological matters. They noted that whilst elements such as crowd scenes could be made more effective on film, the weak acting of opera singers might become more apparent on screen. They were also concerned that rewriting the story to better serve the cinematic medium would undermine the musical logic. In some ways, such reservations mirrored similar concerns in the West. For instance, in the 1930s, one commentator declared that, quote, "The unreal world of opera and the naturalistic film have nothing whatever in common," end quote, while Theodor Adorno and Hans Eisler claimed that the medium transfer from opera to film demonstrated a populist shift that constituted nothing less than the selling out of culture. Yet ideological demand trumped any political misgivings about film opera. Adaptations of operas from the republics became not merely an obscure subgenre of film opera, but rather its most prolific commodity. The first film operas to be produced in the Soviet Union were, in fact, Dekada operas, namely Mykola Lysenko's Natalka Poltavka and Semyon Hulak-Atomovsky's comic Singspiel Cossack Beyond the Danube. Both films were the work of Ukrainian director Ivan Kavaleridze, who, like Shostakovich, had recently been the victim of a public denunciation. On the 28th of January 1936, the infamous article Muddle Instead of Music appeared in Pravda. The article condemned Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk and instigated a highly negative campaign against the composer, constituting the first move in a broader smear campaign against formalism in art. That's this one on the left here. Just 2 weeks later, a similar article appeared criticising Kavaleridze's recent film Prometheus. The main objection of the editorial was that the film contravened historical truth, particularly in terms of its representation of events in the North Caucasus. Like the attack on Shostakovich, the review also took issue with the film's formalist aesthetic. The review described the film as over-thematized, mnogotemye, whilst wooden characters were, quote, bereft of life, like yellow pictures in an old photo album, end quote. Just as Shostakovich in 1937 posited his Fifth Symphony as a creative response to just criticism, referring to the condemnation targeted against Lady Macbeth, Kavaleridze's turn to ideological, temperate film operas with a kind of personal perestroika. In his memoirs, published over 50 years later, after reflecting bitterly on the injustice of the Pravda attack, Kavaleridze stated that, quote, after the setback of Prometheus, I stood at a crossroads, end quote. Dismissing the idea of creating film documentaries and film adaptations on various sanctioned Ukrainian themes, he resolved to make films of the two principal operas performed at the 1936 Ukrainian Dekada. This was the first Dekada. The first film, Natalka Poltavka, was released in 1936 and constitutes a love story between Natalka and Petro, interrupted by the elderly landowner Vozny, who tries to claim Natalka for his own. Lecherous landowners became common villains of Soviet operas of this period, bearing obvious propagandistic parallels with the dekulakization campaign. Even Shostakovich went to great pains to emphasize the kulak-like qualities of his villains in Lady Macbeth. Kavaleridze's second film opera, the comical Cossack Beyond the Danube, was released in 1937. It focuses on the Ukrainian Zaporozhians who were banished in Turkey. The bumbling drunkard Ivan Karas becomes the unlikely hero after a chance encounter with the Sultan, who is travelling incognito around the country. Bargaining with the Sultan, Karas manages to secure the Zaporozhians' repatriation, and this estranged community crosses the Danube back into Ukraine. Marina Flova-Walker has convincingly shown how the Soviet opera project failed. Operas produced by Russian composers failed to gain canonicity, mostly as a result of the inhibiting effect of the bureaucratic machine that mediated cultural life, and through the constant process of criticism and self-criticism to which Russian composers were subjected. Operas from the republics, however, enjoyed a more favourable ideological status. As a result, they were not subject to the same strictures and received sufficiently universal publicity to allow a canon to flourish. For example, after the 1936 Ukrainian Dekada, the Kiev Opera Theatre went on tour around the Soviet Union, which allowed the Dekada's operas to receive a wider audience. And the resident cast of the Bolshoi Theatre proudly furthered the cause of Ukrainian opera by mounting Lysenko's Taras Bulba in the season following the successful Ukrainian Dekada. Amateur performances of these works were also encouraged. For example, on the 30th of October 1937, the following year, Cossack Beyond the Danube was given an amateur staging in Belarusia at an all-Belarusian Olympiad for amateur artistic performances. The Olympiads were sort of amateur music festivals. They sort of ran in parallel with the Dekadas. The table lists film adaptations of opera staged in the pre-war Dekadas. The efficiency with which these operas were canonized may be seen from the wide range of production dates. Although these films emerged in the 1930s, national film studios continued to produce lavish portrayals of early Soviet national operas in the 1980s. The 1950s saw a sharp rise in the output of Soviet film operas, and critics were excited by the opportunity to use the ever-advancing technology to bring opera to the masses. One such critic noted that, quote, film versions of Russian classical operas, with the help of the best opera artists in the land, will undoubtedly be greeted with joy by the people, End quote. Another, in a review of Vasily Latopkinish's 1954 remake of The Cossack Beyond the Danube, concluded that, quote, the use of cinematic laws in committing operas, ballets, and concerts to screen is not an end in itself, but rather a means of conveying great musical works to the widest possible audience in all their unfading beauty. End quote. In a similar vein to Kavaleridze's films, the first Soviet film operas were musical comedies. The 1945 film of Gajibyekov's comic opera Arshin Mal Alan, The Cloth Peddler, was personally commissioned by Stalin. It earned Gajibyekov his second Stalin Prize in 1946, the first of which had been awarded belatedly in 1944 for his opera The Blind Man's Son, which had been positively received alongside Arshin at the 1938 Azeri Dekada. The film became the most famous to be produced in Azerbaijan and inspired Georgian filmmakers to respond with their own comic opera, Keto and Kote, though this work never fully matched the success of the Azeri predecessor. As the production of film operas accelerated in the 1950s, filmmakers turned to operas beyond the genre of comic operetta. The Georgian State Film Studio produced films of Zachary Paliashvili's Absalom and Atari in 1966 and Twilight in 1971, and Belarusia followed with a film of Anatol Bogatyayov's In the Forest of Pilesia in 1982. In the 1980s, Armenia produced extravagant films of Spendiaryan's Almast and Armen Tigranyan's Anush, both which had been first popularized at the 1939 Armenian Dekada. They both remain in the regular repertory of Armenia's Yerevan Opera Theatre, like many of the other republic's opera houses who still perform their own Dekada operas and ballets. These film operas trod the fine line between embodying national authenticity while simultaneously constructing a unified Soviet identity. This mission was widely adopted by those who made films about or in the republics. Oksana Sarkisova has demonstrated that documentaries made about the peripheral republics, quote, juxtapose pre-revolutionary backwardness and Soviet modernization, whether by visualing ethnic differences or depicting the emerging of nations, end quote. Whilst each opera was branded an artifact of its home culture, these works were frequently marketed as the common property of the whole Soviet Union. This is exemplified by the fact that many such films were sung in Russian or released in two versions dubbed in both Russian and the national vernacular. Films ensured that the spirit of the transnational opera project were kept alive for many decades to come, even as the utopian dream of the Soviet multinational state began to sour. Whilst a canon of operas had been established at the Dekada, film opera ensured that the canon was immortalized. To conclude, Benjamin Curtis has argued that nationalist composers in the 19th century, such as Wagner, Smetana and Grieg, acted as national intellectuals. Rather than merely expressing national values, he argues, composers were actively engaged in constructing culture and national identity. The case of ethnic opera production and dissemination in the Soviet Union exemplifies the extent to which such practices continued to prevail in the 20th century. The long-term cultural influence of national opera repertoire, established at the Dekadas in the 1930s, demonstrates that composers did not just express pre-existing national topics in a performative paradigm, but were actually engaged in the perestroika of national identity and transnational cultural discourse. As this repertoire continued to proliferate, both in each opera's own republic and elsewhere around the Soviet Union, the phenomenon went some way to demonstrating that the multinational union could cohere within a unified Soviet identity. In the latter half of the 20th century, the production of film operas was relatively sparse in the West. Yet the ideological support that film opera enjoyed in the Soviet Union goes some way to explaining why it continued to prevail, as ideologues fostered the utopian dream of co-opting technological advances to bring grand artifacts of cultural achievement to the ever-idolized masses. The continued production of ethnic film operas well into the 1980s exemplifies how the effects of the transnational opera project extended well beyond the 10-day duration of the festivals at which they were conceived. The significant cultural influence that this repertoire exerted, and continues to exert, is surely reason enough to devote more scholarly attention to this repertory than has yet been granted. Thank you.